Good afternoon, POL347 students. Welcome to our 16th and final lecture of the semester. Today we're going to be looking at two related chapters and related themes. The first of which is we're going to look into opinion research to try to determine whether or not there's been a convergence of values in Canada, the United States, and Mexico since NAFTA was established in the middle of the 1990s, and if so, whether NAFTA is a culprit for any kind of convergence in values that can be identified. So that is the White and Nevitt chapter from the textbook. Secondly, we'll look at various articulations and various attempts to establish North America as a cultural, economic, and security community who are driving those attempts and what the political implications of those attempts are. So that's Brodie's concluding chapter of the textbook. So hopefully we'll find some common themes that tie these chapters together, and we'll be able to use that to help you with your final with your second midterm. So moving on to a few class announcements. So midterm number 2, which includes everything up to and including today's lecture, is going to go online this coming Wednesday. So that's Wednesday, May the 6th at 8 a.m. It's going to be due this coming Saturday, Saturday the 9th at 8 a.m. There are going to be no discussion questions this week. I'm going to give you this week off of those to hopefully help you with a bit of the workflow heading into this final stretch of the semester. And finally, your pre-exam period grades are going to be posted on Moodle by a week from today, so by the morning of Monday, May the 11th. So as you know, kind of per college-wide regulations, you have until the final day of classes, which is Tuesday the 12th, to elect to take this course as a pass-fail class, and I believe you can do that with the Dean of Students, or you can do that through the administration. So I'll make sure that at least give you a sense of how you're doing going into the final paper, which is going to be due on, I believe, the 16th. So starting with White and Nevitt, the focus here is on integration and identity. So the big question here is, has regional integration led distinct national identities in each of the three countries to give way to a more common and more cosmopolitan continental idea? So a kind of hybrid identity. Has that been fostered by the increasing interactions economically, politically, and culturally that we've seen under NAFTA? So do people now identify themselves as North American in contrast to their distinct national identities? And are values and attitudes converging among citizens of each country to any substantial degree? So what we're using as a framework here, and what I guess is like the sort of the baseline, is the functionalist view, which has been established most directly in public opinion studies of Europe and European public opinion following European integration. The idea here is that increased trade flows and greater contact between peoples will invariably result to a convergence of values. So as people interact with one another to a greater extent, both in terms of economic exchanges and political and cultural exchanges, you'll get something of a melting pot of values, and that people's values and attitudes and opinions will start to bleed into those of one another's, and you'll see less of a distinct cultural difference between the various countries within that economic framework. So generally speaking, this convergence is one towards a more kind of a globalized cosmopolitan mindset, characterized by openness to other cultures and permissiveness of values and practices that are foreign to one's own values, so more of a relativistic orientation towards other cultures and other peoples, and more of kind of an open curiosity as opposed to a closed fear of other cultures. So a substantial amount of public opinion research has gone into mapping out distinct political cultures, national cultures within North America. So what a political culture is a set of values that are widely endorsed by opinion leaders, so your politicians, your educators, your intellectuals, your journalists, and those that end up animating core political institutions. So here in North America, we have three distinct countries. We have three perceptible political cultures. So starting here in the United States, you can think of a civic culture, which is very participatory. So people in the United States take a very active and engaged approach to American democracy, or at least they have historically. There's a definite libertarian and individualistic bent to how people think here in the United States. And for the most part, there's been an aversion to big government. So the United States has been, when you look at government policies, there's a distinct lack of universal policies. So since things like universal health care, which exists in most other most other rich countries, is conspicuously non-existent from here in the United States. And you could look at a similar approach to how the United States does things like income assistance and just broader social welfare policies. There's a distinct aversion to the state playing an active role in the economy. So contrast this with the Canadian political culture. So Canada, in various terms, has been viewed and conceptualized as kind of an anti-America. So Canadians, by and large, have gravitated towards a set of values that is, by design, non-American, and by design distinct from the kind of values that Americans have gravitated towards. So in terms of how Canadians engage with the government, so Canadians are actively engaged in terms of they vote and they monitor political issues between elections, but for the most part, they leave the day-to-day business of governing to political elites. And for the most part, Canadians tolerate more governmental intervention in society and are somewhat more deferential to authority than are Americans. And finally, in Mexico, definitely under the PRI, and even to today, you have a somewhat paternalistic political culture in which citizens tolerate centralized political authority, but at the same time expect the state to play an active role in managing and ensuring their well-being. So you have more deference to the state in Mexico, but also a greater set of expectations placed upon the state. So to me, a very illuminating and a very tragic illustration of differing political cultures between the United States and Canada can be observed just in the past few weeks. So as some of you will know, Canada, 2 weeks ago, it suffered its worst mass shooting in history. It took place in the Atlantic province of Nova Scotia. So the perpetrator was actually a horrific chain of events, but the perpetrator managed to get his hands on a decommissioned police car and a police uniform, and disguised as a police officer, he managed to gain the trust of the victims and systematically gun his victims down. So all told, this was a massacre that went on for several hours, and all told, the individual killed 22 people and injured 3 more. However, not 2 weeks later, in response to this tragedy, which has really rocked the nation, the Trudeau government has announced a ban on 1,500 different types of assault weapons. So this is the largest blanket ban on weapons, the largest one-shot gun control initiative in Canadian history. And early polling, obviously, on this measure is quite uncertain because it's a measure that quite literally was taken a few days ago. But the earliest indication is that this move enjoys overwhelming support among the Canadian public. Early estimates are somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 in 5 Canadians support these new gun control measures that were taken in response, very quickly and very dramatically to this unprecedented Canadian tragedy. So I want to ask you all, how does this reflect a distinction, a fundamental distinction between Canada's political culture and the political culture we have here in the United States? Given our very long and very failed and very flummoxed history with attempting to initiate gun control measures in response to, as we'll know, a number of separate mass shootings that have gone on and continue to go on here in the United States without a coordinated federal response in terms of curtailing the supply of guns here in the United States. So what does this Flashpoint, sort of a shocking national tragedy, followed by a swift response in Canada, versus a series of tragedies here in the United States, and still a lack of sustained federal accommodation or sustained federal response. What does that say about how Canada's political culture differs from that here in the United States? So I want you to think about that question. So how do White and Nevitt go about testing whether or not values have converged under NAFTA? So they utilized NAFTA from before, they utilized data from before, during, and after the process of continental integration. So they utilize the 1981, 1990, and 2000 waves of the World Value Survey, which some of you will know is a massive data set that issues a similar battery of questions to people in, I believe, all 192 or 193 of the world's country. So they use this massive data set to test the hypothesis that NAFTA in and of itself, per the functionalist hypothesis, has led to a convergence of values among Canadians, Americans, and Mexicans, respectively. So here are some of their key findings. The first of which is, despite the continental integration agenda, that agenda being pushed by a lot of powerful people, national identities remain strong in all three countries, and as a matter of fact, there's some evidence that they're getting stronger over time. Secondly, Canadians and Americans, certain Americans, so more Americans in blue states and in major cities, have started to embrace a more post-material value template, which is characterized by being more open for government intervention and government support in the economic realm, thinking that the government should do more to compensate those among us who are disadvantaged in the economy and disadvantaged by the free market. But this, however, looks like it's more driven by common generational factors than it is by anything that's unique to NAFTA in and of itself. So in particular, younger people, Generation X and onward, they're more likely to be overeducated and underpaid. So that's me. There are more young people who hold college degrees and in many cases postgraduate degrees who are still on the lower end of the income spectrum. So those individuals don't fit neatly into the undeserving poor, into the category of people who are poor because they've made poor life choices. They're poor despite having done all the right things and made all the right decisions. So those individuals tend to be more charitable to the notion that certain people, through no fault of their own, are disadvantaged by the economy and the government should step in to help them out. By contrast, Mexicans have become more skeptical of the market, even more skeptical than they were before NAFTA was a thing, but it's hard to disentangle this consequence from either one, NAFTA, or the broader neoliberal policy that was hugely unpopular that the PRI carried out through the 1990s. It's very difficult to disentangle NAFTA in and of itself from the broader PRI liberalizing agenda and the PRI having to wear that agenda. So the conclusion here is that there's some evidence of Canada-United States convergence, although it's probably not NAFTA that's been driving this convergence. It's more of common economic and generational effects that aren't in and of themselves related to NAFTA. Mexico here is the clear outlier in terms of being substantially more statist and also having a set of values that are substantially more intolerant than those that are exhibited in Canada and the United States. So moving on to Brodie. So Brodie writes about, and this is the concluding chapter of the textbook, she writes about performing North America as a community. So her argument here is it actually kind of takes aim at the Canadians, which I thought was really interesting, because for the most part we think about Americans as being the bad guys within continental integration. But this chapter is actually quite critical of a number of Canadian elites and their efforts to co-opt the agenda and sort of shift the agenda to suit their economic interests. So the argument here is that a flurry of then recent conferences, reports, and Canadian government initiatives that were pushing a common North American identity as kind of a rhetorical narrative and trope are largely performative. By this she means that allusions to North America as a distinct geopolitical space with shared values and interests, they aim to create a future reality, a desired reality, rather than to describe reality as it exists. So the notion of a North American community is in itself an exercise in aspirational thinking. The people who push this notion as an inevitable descriptive construct, do so because they desperately want it to be one in the future. So again, the North American agenda is pushed primarily by Canadian business elites who are eager to secure stable export markets for Canadian resources, goods, and services. So the really big player throughout this chapter is the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, which, as its name indicates, it's a consortium of the chief executive officers of Canada's largest firms. So these are very, very big and powerful economic actors within Canada. They have massive, massive economic stakes into maintaining open markets between the United States and Canada. So a lot of this kind of dates back to and fits into this long-running trope in Canadian history of this massive American market being something of a holy grail for Canadian business interests. So remember, Canada was then and forever will be saddled with the problem, the essential condition of being a big empty country. So in general, Canada produces far more than it consumes, and there's massive unmet supply of things like food, things like energy, things like mineral wealth in domestic Canadian markets. So Canada is forever in search of external outlets for goods that are produced within Canada, and it just so happens that Canada happens to be situated right above the world's richest and most ravenous market for commodities and market for consumer goods. So you have a very long-running history of Canada seeking more secure, more permanent access to American markets, but getting rebuffed at every step along the way. So Canada finally in the 1970s. At this point, Canada is under Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. At this point, Canada is desperately seeking out other partners because the United States has, in response to its own economic difficulties, it's set up very high tariff walls, and it's taken a very protectionist posture. So Canada, quite desperately at this point in time, attempts to court new partners. So looking to places like the United Kingdom, where at one point it had a colonial relationship, to the rising economies of East Asia, and even at one point, Pierre Trudeau takes a very infamous trip to Cuba to attempt to cultivate alliances outside of the United States. And we'll actually get into that on the next slide and how that trip to Cuba, Pierre Trudeau's notorious visit to Cuba, how that's since been interpreted. A lot of very interesting conspiracy theories surrounding that visit. But finally, Canada kind of raises its arm up and concedes in around the middle of the 1980s that its only viable strategy for sustained economic development is freer trade with the United States. It's tried its other options. It's exhausted its other options. No other viable options exist. So there's not going to be any kind of market for Canadian exports, consistent market, that is ever going to take the place of the United States. Sort of Canada as an independent and profitable and economically prosperous entity is tied at the hip to the United States, whether it likes it or not. So it uses these findings and it uses this realization to set up the stage and to initiate free trade negotiations with the United States, which ultimately materializes in the Canada-U.S. trade agreement, which is the predecessor, as we know, to NAFTA. So as promised, here is a snapshot of Pierre Trudeau's now notorious 1976 visit to Cuba, where he visited Fidel Castro. So this was in support of his then ongoing third option agenda, to try to the best of his ability, establish Canada's brand outside of the United States and cultivate alliances, economic, security, and otherwise, that transcended the Canada-U.S. bilateral relationship. So despite the fact that Justin Trudeau himself was 3 years old at this point, so there are pictures of Fidel Castro holding Justin Trudeau as a toddler, this trip has nevertheless spurred rumors that Justin Trudeau is the biological son of Fidel Castro. So I've actually given you a side-by-side comparison of Fidel Castro when he's young. So it's Fidel Castro with the basketball in his hands. So that's a picture of a young Fidel Castro. It's next to a picture of a young Justin Trudeau. So I have to admit that the resemblance is there. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that one. But it's very interesting sort of conspiracy theory that has formed out of this notorious visit to Cuba on the part of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who at this point was Canada's Prime Minister. So moving on to 9/11. So we've covered this a little bit in our discussion of borders. So the 9/11 attacks, they shift the gaze of American security officials toward what is viewed as a porous and a dangerously undefended border with Canada. And this is, again, despite the fact that none of the 9/11 hijackers came in through Canada. This is just a security concern that stemmed from a narrative that the United States is vulnerable, that came after the 9/11 attacks. So there was a ton of anxiety in Canada's business community following the 9/11 attacks. The idea that there would be a thickening of Canada-U.S. borders. So even a slight impediment to cross-border flows of goods and capital could be calamitous to Canada. At this point, exports to the United States alone accounted for just under 40% of Canada's GDP. So we talk about Canada and the U.S. as being attached at the hip. I think an appropriate analogy, if an unappetizing one, is we can think of Canada as being the weaker of the two conjoined twins. So think about Canada and the United States being conjoined twins, Canada being the non-dominant one. If that relationship is severed, Canada essentially shrivels up and dies. Again, I'm sorry for the graphic nature of that analogy, but it strikes me as an appropriate one. So there's understandably a substantial amount of anxiety here that permeates the entire business community in Canada. So in response, Canadian think tanks and business groups, they launch a coordinated effort to establish economic and security discourses as one and the same, to tie those two discourses together, to conflate the Canada-U.S. economic relationship with the Canada-U.S. security relationship. They think by doing so, that will allow them to craft a winning argument and a winning frame with security-obsessed American Bush administration officials. So here, in quite vivid and painstaking detail, they conjure up the image of a fortress North America, one with open internal markets, but in exchange very strong external barriers. So once you're in Fortress North America, movement is quite free, but it's quite hard to get into the fortress due to very high security barriers and very high economic barriers. So due to a common security perimeter, which is state-of-the-art, as well as a common external tariff, which secures not only a common North American security environment, but also a common North American economic market. So this culminates in the Security and Prosperity Partnership, which in actuality is a massive win for Canada's business community. It's Canada's business community at this point that's driving the narrative, that's pushing the narrative, and this narrative comes to fruition in 2005. So in March of that year, the heads of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, they meet in Waco, Texas. So some of you might be hearing about Waco because of the new Netflix series that just dropped last week. But Waco, Texas has another important historical significance as the site of where the Canada, United States, and Mexico Security and Prosperity Partnership was signed. So under this partnership, the three parties agreed to greater regulatory cooperation, energy and a common energy security strategy for making North America energy independent. So through a strategy that included but was not limited to the construction of cross-national pipelines. So the Keystone XL pipeline, which connects Alberta to Texas, is a very important part of that link. Common screening of overseas travelers, as well as a series of interministerial working groups. So still nothing that approaches to the level of political integration of the European Union, but establishing continental issues as issues that are of cabinet level significance, that are of a high priority. So what's quite uncanny here is that the language that's used, the language that's found in the final Security and Prosperity Partnership, it parrots in a number of ways language that was used in an earlier series of reports published by Canadian think tanks. So again, the Canadian business elite has a massive win here in that they're able to establish the frame that ultimately wins the day, and they're able to, through their conferences and through their reports, set out some of the language that is ultimately included in the final text of the Security and Prosperity Partnership. So what are some of the key takeaways from Brodie? So in contrast to the functionalist view, Brodie argues that nothing is inevitable about continental integration. That continental integration, it doesn't happen in and of itself. It happens as a result of a number of strategic decisions and maneuvers that get made by coordinated and strategic political elites. In this case, it's Canadian elites who are driving the agenda. Secondly, a North American community, in and of itself, it's been a product of a careful framing and a coordinated PR push by the Canadian business community. So it's worth noting here that Canadian business elites are consistently more pro-United States than is the general Canadian population. So 37% of business elites in Canada, according to a 2000 poll, say that Canada should be more like the United States versus only 14% of the general population. So it's quite important to note that elite opinion in Canada is generally speaking pro-American and generally speaking in favor of closer political and economic and cultural integration with the United States. And finally, and most distressingly, Canada risks putting itself in harm's way, so making itself indistinguishable from the United States and abandoning its own values and principles, humanitarian ones in particular, through closer ties with the American empire. So one prominent example of this, I know a few of you are planning to write papers on this, is the Safe Third Country Agreement that came into force near the end of 2004. To what extent did this agreement reflect an abrogation of Canadian humanitarian principles? And to what extent did Canada sell out refugees from places like Central America and the Caribbean who might need to go through the United States in order to access Canadian immigration officials? So if anything does come up from today's lecture on the midterm, and I realize it's a very quick turnaround. It's going to be a broad question about North America as a cultural community. So I suggest you focus more on some of these broad takeaways from Brodie as you do your last minute preparations for Wednesday's midterm exam. So I think I'm going to leave it at there. Thank you so much for your time. And just by way of conclusion, I wanted to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for your patience with me and just how fully you've engaged with the material under very difficult circumstances. I've really enjoyed reading your forum posts. They're consistently the highlight of my week, and it means the world to me that you all are staying engaged and you're staying focused and you're staying with me as much as possible despite the circumstances. So I would have loved to have done this in person, but I really enjoyed this group of students. I'm going to miss you all, and I'm sorry that things had to be this way, but this has been a great group of students for me to engage with. I've really enjoyed this semester as unique as it's been. So I'm going to leave it at that. Good luck with the rest of the week. Good luck with your paper assignments. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.